Wouldn't it be nice to take a spring break from some house payments? SaveWithConrad.com can show you how to skip your next 2 house payments and get a cheaper monthly payment. We routinely help our podcast listeners save $500, $600, $700, even $800 a month. And I'm talking to you if you're in a 30-year loan or if you've got credit card debt. It's not a matter of if we can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com. NMLS number 65084, equal housing lender. And oh, by the way, it's no cost, no obligation. And if I can't save you money, I won't waste your time. Even credit scores in the 500s can be approved, and we're licensed in more than 40 states. So what are you waiting for? Lower your monthly payments today at SaveWithConrad.com. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to Dark Side of the Podcast. You may have been expecting a little more Grillin' JR content. That's coming your way tomorrow. But today, we figure, you know what? Let's make the most of our little quarantine time together, and let's talk about the best new series on professional wrestling. Of course, we're talking about Dark Side of the Ring. It airs Tuesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on Vice. And joining us again today to discuss the Dr. D Slap Heard Round the World episode, the creators of that show, Evan and Jason. Jason, how are you, man?
Good. How you doing?
Man, I'm excited to be here. Evan, have you gotten any sleep? It feels like every time I talk to you on Wednesday, you're dragging a little bit because of the afterglow of your baby airing.
That and all the wrestlers texting me at 4 a.m, getting their opinions in. You know,
there's a lot of times like I'll call Evan like the day after, and he's like, "Man, I was up till like 4 a.m. talking to this wrestler." It's like, man, no sleep.
Yeah, they all take it out on me, and yeah. So I'm hanging in. I'm gonna hang in as best I can today and give everyone, the best of what I can today. But it's gonna be a little slower than normal, I think, today.
Jason, start from the beginning. How does this subject make it to your list? Like, as a tape trader, I was first familiar with this in, I don't know, probably 1980 or 1996 or 97. And it became something that a lot of guys sort of passed around on VHS. And that's the first time I saw it. But if I'm honest, I haven't really thought about it since. But it is a fascinating story. How was this on your radar? I think I'm even a few years older than you guys.
Well, I was born in 82. So this event happened, I believe, when I was like 2 years old. So I didn't know anything about it at the time. But this is it, the clip of David Schultz slapping John Stossel, the 2020 reporter, is kind of one of the very first, I think, like viral wrestling clips. Yeah. Like even I remember even when we got our first computer and there was, like wrestling clips from years prior to myself, like watching it, like appearing online. I remember like seeing that clip and it being like almost, even from what I remember, even one of the first kind of viral clips just in general that I saw online. And it was just, it was at the time just so captivating, like to see something like that, to see something just so like raw and in that way. That is all, it's always stayed in my mind. And so,
it was like the Winnebago Man of wrestling clips,
Yeah.
And I think the very first time I saw it, again, just being the age that I am, I didn't, and because, David Schultz really was kind of out of the limelight by the time I was, getting hip to wrestling, that like, it was kind of like, who is this guy? This clip was so funny, for, lack of a better word. And it's also amazing, but it was kind of like, who is this guy and what's the story behind this guy? And I never really, knew much about it, but I'd seen it like hundreds and hundreds of times. And then it was like, for when it came around time to discuss season 2 topics, this wasn't really something that was on, I think, our radars as a story, right, Jason? Like this wasn't something we ever talked about as a episode.
It's like always been brought up as just one of those like pivotal like moments, that people talk about, but we never really thought at first, like, is there really enough there to like tell an hour's worth of television,
Yeah, and exactly. And so, and then after season 1 came out, I got contacted by 2 separate people. One is a wrestling promoter named Herb Simmons, And I was also contacted by Barbara Goodish, who is Bruiser Brody's widow, and they both told me independently that basically, David Schultz is ready to tell his story now, and like is like looking for you, And I was like, whoa, really? And then I was thinking like, whoa, that's interesting. And so it was really one of the first times that, because now we had the season out, it was really one of the first times that like a wrestler has approached us to tell their story. And so that really was like interesting. Yeah. And then I starting to look at it, it was kind of like, well, we could kind of look back at not only just that moment in time, which is amazing, but also like the context of it is key, but also like that whole 2020 expose, because it really is one of the first like national TV exposés. I believe, it's one of the first like big ones on that scale. And so it was kind of like, and then you kind of look at how it comes at a very interesting time in wrestling history, when the tide is about to turn, kind of going from wrestling to sports entertainment. And so it's kind of like, what's the whole context of that situation? How did this piece come together? And then, of course, like, wouldn't it be fascinating if you could get John Stossel to talk about it?
So, Jason, talk me through this. How do you guys get John Stossel? Because I got to tell you, it feels like he would have been the hardest person to pin down for this story. You guys already had a relationship with Jim Cornette. You said Dr. D was looking for you, and I feel like
before that too, I also wanted to say, I just recalled too, the first time I met David Schultz was at StarCast when we premiered the Bruiser Brody episode there. And he was like really like one of the people I didn't know at the time that I wanted to like tell his story.
Right.
But I was just so intrigued because I knew he was friends with Bruiser Brody. And like Evan and I are just so captivated with meeting people who like come from that era and who like, especially the wrestlers who walked alongside like Bruiser Brody. There's just something just so fascinating about like that group of like performers at that time. So, and even when I met him at StarCast, like I was intimidated. Like I kind of paced, I think, in front of his table maybe for like 20 minutes before I like built up the courage to introduce myself. And he was nice. He was a little standoffish, but we like ended up walking down the hall and he just kind of reminisced about Brody a little bit. But I felt like comfortable enough with him that I was like, when we came up with this idea of the episode, I was like really excited and intrigued to like spend more time with him because I knew there was a lot there. I knew that there was a lot kind of hidden underneath this shell, that there was much more to this man than this like really tough exterior that he's like putting out here. But to jump forward to getting in contact with John Stossel, I do remember that being like difficult. I do remember just even like the process, like when we did get him, like our time with him was just so limited. We only had like 30 minutes.
25 minutes probably. I think it was 25 minutes. It actually was someone who doesn't get nearly enough credit for season 2, which was our series producer Alex McIntosh, who worked with us on season 2, and he did everything. He was right there on the front lines with us producing this season, and he actually. It was either he volunteered or was tasked with actually, Project John Stossel, in terms of getting him on board. And it was Alex that actually reached out to him, I think, through ABC News, or like found some way to get in touch with him and got in touch with his assistant. And then they kind of traded some emails, and then he finally got his opportunity to talk to John on the phone, and they had a conversation about it. And, it was very like, John said essentially the same stuff that he said on air, as it is like annoyingly one of the things that people always ask him about, so many years later out of all the pieces he's done. And, talking about the lawsuit and talking about the jurosomatic illness. And then he agreed to doing it, but it was basically like, I'm going to give you 25 minutes of my time. And like, which is by far and away the shortest interview that we've ever done for all of the show. But so we used pretty much almost every single bit from his interview is in the show. But we were so excited. Actually, one of the more exciting moments for me getting him on board, because I was just very exhilarated by just the thought of like intercutting, John and David in the episode, and just how that dynamic is going to play, and being able to really make that scene of like in that hallway and like everything leading up to it feel like very feel big. So that was something we were really excited about. And it kind of felt like, okay, this is really going to be cool now, because we'll be able to kind of tell a different side of the story too, which we always try and do. So it was a huge win to get John on board.
Before we talk about everything else that we saw in the episode, I feel like we should talk about the other person who we haven't mentioned, Eddie Mansfield. Jason, right or wrong, I have been sort of conditioned as a wrestling fan to hate Eddie Mansfield, just because every shoot interview I've ever seen from any wrestler ever seems to hate Eddie Mansfield. And then I finally got to see some of him last night where he's saying, "Kayfabe, how stupid is that? Who came up with that?" And, it's very sort of, I don't know, the polar opposite of what we've heard, quote unquote, old school wrestlers to think and behave like. What'd you think of Eddie Mansfield your first time you got to meet him or had an interaction with him?
Well, I actually wasn't there for this interview. It was one of the few interviews I didn't get a chance to be there for, because I was doing other parts of the show. But it like, in most cases when we do interview wrestlers, you get that side where they're defending it, and they're defending the integrity of wrestling, especially wrestlers who come from that era. So it was fascinating to hear from somebody who has like a completely opposite perspective, for the most part, from that we're normally used to hearing.
Yeah. And when we were putting this together, so, and just to back up just like a little bit, when we first talked to David, so, David really wanted to talk to me and to get in contact with us to actually do this episode. And David and I had a very long conversation on the phone. He was super cool, super charming, and was telling me all about his life and the basically like what he does today, which is like his whole like sleep cycle and him just like working out in these fields and building stuff, and he hasn't slowed down one bit. And then from there, it just kind of was like, okay, like he's a really compelling character for a documentary, no doubt. But it was kind of like, once we have that in place, who else are we going to get to talk about this? Obviously, John Stossel,
right?
But we are going to need other voices. And that's when it was kind of like, okay, let's try to make this episode kind of, a look back at the 2020 expose. And obviously, Eddie Mansfield plays a huge part of that. So we because he's like the counterweight to the whole thing. He's the person exposing the business when you have David as the one standing up for it. And this whole story too just speaks like to our core themes of our show, which is we always look at the reality versus fiction aspect of wrestling, and this is kind of our way of covering the wrestling is fake ? Phenomenon, and kind of looking deep into that. And obviously we knew Jim Cornette, like this would be a great vehicle for him,
of course,
because it's a subject he's very passionate about, and so we thought he would be a great historical voice for this. But Eddie Mansfield was absolutely crucial because, he's interviewed in the piece and he can talk and explain his side of the story, and the fact that he is this kind of lightning rod of, controversy to those in the know about his position on wrestling and his motivations for what he did. So we didn't really, sometimes interviews that are the hardest to schedule, the hardest to get on board, are the ones you wouldn't necessarily expect. And this one was extremely challenging to get booked, so to speak. And again, this was somebody who we'll have on the show next week, which I'm really excited about, is Howard Sheffman.